This is Instructor Paul, and in this lecture, we're going to expand our PowerShell script that creates user accounts from our comma separated value files. Now, I received a message from one of my students, and he wanted to create users on a first initial last name basis. So instead of using what we did, first name dot last name here, you can see that right here, he wants to do the first initial and then the last name of the user account. Additionally, he might have a scenario where he has Paul Hill and Patrick Hill. Now, they would both have the same username, P Hill. He wanted to be able to append a number to the end of the username so that he can create the accounts for both users and they'll still both have unique usernames. I'm going to show you how to do this. I figured instead of just responding to his message one-on-one even if I had him post it on the discussion board, I figured a video lecture is better. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to walk you guys through this, and we're just going to expand the script that we already have. Okay, and the way that we're going to do this, we're going to write two functions. So I'm going to go down here, and I'm going to declare a function, and we're going to call this verify with a lowercase verify, and then an uppercase username. Okay, and we're going to accept username as a variable that we pass through the function, and we're going to write another function. And this is going to be called username taken. And we're going to pass username. Okay, so we have these two functions. Now let's write comments about what these are supposed to do. So this first function is going to see if a username is already in use. If it is, then return the number that should be appended to the end of the name. To the end of the name. Else, return an empty string. And I'm going to make this go down a new line. There we go. We'll just make it easy to read. Okay. So we're going to see if the username is already in use, whatever we pass to this function here. If the username is in use, then this function is going to return a number. So in our example, if we have Patrick Hill and P Hill, so if we created P Hill first and then we're trying to create Patrick Hill, we want to append a 1 to Patrick Hill's user account. So it'd be P Hill 1 for Patrick Hill. Okay, now if the user account is not in use, for example, Paul Hill, then we're not going to return anything. We're going to return an empty string so that nothing will be appended to the username. All right, now before we write these functions here, we're going to have to do a little bit of work up here at the top. So let's go ahead and declare a couple variables. First thing we want to do is we're going to do account number. Okay, and that's going to be equal to, we'll write that in a second. The next variable we're going to declare is the username. All right, and that's going to be equal to, we'll write that in just a second. So first, this account number is going to call this function verify username. So I'm just going to copy that, come up here and paste that. And we're going to pass the first name and last name. Okay. So I'm just going to copy this name here, and then we'll just edit it instead of typing it out. Okay. Now we'll get rid of this space because we don't need that space. So what we're going to have here is first name plus last name. Now remember, we're going to be working on a first initial and then last name basis. So let me give you a little tip here. So down here in the bottom, we're going to do F name, and we're going to say my first name is Paul. We'll use my information here. I'm going to press enter, and I'm going to declare last name is equal to Hill. Okay. Now, if we say echo, and then in parentheses, we say F name, let's go down here, select F name plus, and then we do L name, and then close parentheses, we get Paul Hill. Now, if I want to get the first initial of that name, the easiest way to do that is to do a square open brace, and then put the 0, and then a closing square brace. What that's going to do is get the first string in this character, or in this variable. So if I press enter now we get P Hill. And I could change that number to get the second, which would be P-A-U-L, so it'd be P-A. So I could get the A, so it'd be A Hill. I could get, U if I wanted to. But what we're going to do is we're going to use this to get the very first initial, or the first letter of my name, which would be my first initial. So now we have P Hill. And then we're going to combine this with like a 1 or a 2 or a 3, depending on how many users there are. Okay, so the username is going to be equal to, again, we're going to go ahead and copy this line up here, this first name plus last name. Also, we're up here, we're going to put in that 0. So we're doing the first initial of the first name, not the whole first name. So I'm going to copy this line and I'm going to go to username. I'm going to paste that. And then we're going to say plus, and we're going to do the account number variable. So plus account number. Okay, so the username will be, first initial. If I pass Paul.Hill or Paul Hill rather, it'll be P. This section will represent P. This section will represent Hill, and this will represent the number that my username needs to have on the end so that it doesn't create a duplicate account. Okay, now real quick, we need to update this code down here, and the name here is also going to be exactly the same, almost exactly the same as this. So we're going to have the first name plus a space, and we're going to copy the space here, plus the last name, and then we're going to put in plus account number. Okay, because you can't have a duplicate name just like you can't have a duplicate username down here. All right, now we're going to replace this line here. This, instead of putting in first name dot last name, we're just going to replace that with username. So we'll go down here. So user principal name is going to be equal to the username, and the username is going to be created up here. Now, one thing that you want to do is not only define the user principal name like we have in the past, you also want to define the SAM account name. So I'm going to copy this line and paste it, and I'm going to change this to SAM account name. And the reason for this is that when you create a user account in Active Directory, by default, if you use the GUI, it's going to enter the SAM account name. Now, like before, when we were using PowerShell, we only defined the user principal name, and this was left blank. So it's a good idea to define both of these variables and setting the username for both of these when you're creating an account with PowerShell. I'll show you an example here. If I right click and I say new user, and I'm under instructorpaul.com and my instructor Paul OU and domain users, if I say new user and I create Paul Hill and I call it P Hill for my username, and I click next, and I'll just make a password here really fast. Okay, and I'll say user must uncheck that checkbox, hit finish. Okay, so if I double click on this really fast, I need to make sure action under view, advanced features. This needs to be enabled to be able to do what I'm about to do. So I'm going to double click on this user, and I'm going to go to the attribute editor. And if we type in the user principal name, so right here, we can see it's P Hill at instructor Paul. Now the SAM account name is just P Hill. So if we're searching for P Hill, and we created this user account using the user principal name and not the SAM account name, this will be defined as not set. All right. So we're going to go back to our PowerShell here, and I think we're about ready to move on down to these functions and complete these functions. So what we're going to do is under verify name, we're going to set an initial variable for I. So I is going to represent the number that we're going to add to the end of our username. Now remember, this function is the only goal of this function is to see if a username is in use. If it is, return the number that should be appended to the username. So what should be added to the end of the name? If nothing is, or if the username is not in use, we want to return a blank string or something like this. And I can just elaborate on this. So example, P Hill 1, P Hill 2, etc. Okay, so we're either going to return a number like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, or we're going to return an empty string, which would make our username look exactly like this. All right, so I is equal to 1. Now we're going to write an if statement, and we're going to say, see if username is taken or in use. Okay, so we're going to say if, and we're going to call this function down here, username taken. So if username taken, and we're going to pass the username that we're checking. So if this is equal to true, this username is taken, then what we need to do is run a while loop. So we're going to say while username taken. I got to make sure I spell that right, otherwise it won't work. While username is taken is equal to, oops, we need to write username is equal to true. Okay, repeat this. And what we're going to repeat is incrementing I. If I can type that right. There we go. Okay, now let me elaborate on what we're doing here. So what we're doing is we're running a check to say if the username is in use or if it's already taken, which is the function we haven't written down here yet. But this is going to return a true or false based on whether that user already exists. And it's just going to be a get AD user query that we're going to run. And then if we find a match, we'll say, hey, that user's already in use. You can't use it. So if that happens, if it's equal to true and that user already exists, then we need to increment I. And that little, if you're not familiar, we define I equals 1 like we're doing up here at the top of the code. We say I equals 1, we can echo I. Again, there's my keyboard not wanting to work. So we can echo I, and that outputs 1 down here in the bottom left. Now, if we type in the command I++, that's going to increment 1 by 1. So now if I echo I, it's equal to 2. And I can type that again, and it's going to equal 3. Okay? So what we're doing is essentially we're incrementing the number that we're going to add to the end of the username because that user is still in use. Okay, so now what we're going to do under this if statement, we're going to write else, and we're going to say return quote quote or an empty string. So if the username is taken, then we're going to increment I and we're going to try and use that. If it's not taken, we're going to return, just an empty string. All right. And this loop is going to break once we've looped or once we found a username that is not taken. All right. So once we find phill3 or phill4, it's not in use, then what we need to do also real quick, we need to add the I to the end of this. So plus I. So while username taken, let me get rid of that there. That doesn't belong there. Okay, sorry about that. So while username taken and then username plus I is equal to true, we're going to increment I and then else return blank. And then once it breaks this loop, it says, hey, I found a username that is not used to phill3 or phill4. We're going to return the number I. Okay. So again, if you remember, the whole point of this function is to see if a username is in use. If it is, return the number that should be appended to the end of the name, which is this line right here. Okay, if the username is not in use, return an empty string, which is going to be completed right here. All right. Really, I think we could probably put this return I up here inside of this else statement, but I'm just going to leave it down there because I'm not too worried about that. Okay, so now what we're going to do is comment for this function, and we're going to say check to see if username already exists. All right. And we're going to run a couple tests. The first thing we're going to do is we'll just call it test 1, and then we're going to write test 2. Oops, test 2. Okay, so test 1 is equal to get AD user. And we're going to say filter, and then we're going to do an open brace, and we're going to say user principal name. Make sure I spell this right. Principal name is equal to, and then we're going to say username. And we're going to do the closing brace there. And we're going to copy this. Let me fix that right there. I didn't mean to press enter. Let's copy this little line of code right here, and we'll put it down on the next line. And we're going to change this to Sam account name. Okay, so if I copy this line of code right here, and I just paste it down here below, and if I change this to, in quotation marks, phill, and press enter, I can echo test 2, and I can see that I was able to find Paul Hill or phill. Now, if I run that again and I look for phill1, and if I try to echo test 2 and press enter, it returns nothing. So essentially, it wasn't able to find that user account. This is how we're going to determine if the user account exists. So up here under this function, what we need to do is write an if statement. So we're going to say if test1 is equal to null, and I'm using a capital N there, and we're going to say and test2. I need to make sure I spell this stuff right. My keyboard is we're going to blame it on the keyboard. Of course, it's not the user, it's definitely the keyboard. So test1 and test2 is equal to null. Then we're going to return false. So we're going to say this user account is not in use. And then we're going to close this with a brace here. And we're going to say else return true. Okay. So let's go ahead and test this function by selecting the entire function, right-clicking and choosing copy. Now we're going to come down to the blue code here, and we're going to right-click and choose paste, and we're going to press enter. Okay, so now we can run this function. So I'm going to expand this a little bit so we can see what's going on here. So we're going to type in username taken, and then in quotes, I'm going to say phill, and I'm going to press enter. Okay, and I messed up again. We need to do a capital F, and let's just move that cursor so you can see. We need to do the $ and a capital F. So it's $ capital T and then true. and then capital sign or dollar sign, and then capital false with the first letter being capital. So I'm going to recopy this. And that's why it's good to just run your code down here in the bottom, because you catch little mistakes like that. So, okay, we're going to run username taken P Hill, and we can see that it returned true. So it thinks that P Hill is already in use, and we know that it is in use because I'm looking at the account right there and we just made it. So now if we try P Hill 1, it returns false. Okay, so now we have a good way of testing of whether our user accounts have been created or not, or whether they're not in use. So I think we're about ready to run this script now. So let me just double check everything here. Let's just run over everything really fast. I'm going to save this at the top. Okay, so this is all the same. We haven't changed anything here. We have our account number, which is going to be equal to this verify username. And our verify username is returning this interval or this variable called I, or it's returning a blank string. So this variable could end up being nothing, but we're still appending it to the end of our name. All right. So down here under name, we're updating this because you cannot have duplicate names, just like you can't have duplicate usernames. So we're having first name, space, last name, space, account number. Then we're going to have given name, first name, surname. That's all the same. And then we're going to have username, which is first name and the first initial, or the first character of the first name. We have last name and then the account number. Then we're declaring the user principal name and the SAM account name. Okay, and that's all that we have changed so far. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to hit the play button, and I'm going to type in the path to our CSV file. So it's new users.csv, and I'm going to press enter. Okay, so now I'll go over to Active Directory, and I'm going to hit F5, and we can see that the user accounts have been created. So we have Clyde Braden, and if I open this account and I go to account, we can see that it's using first initial, last name, so C Braden. Now, if we run the script again and we do the same path, new users.csv, it should append a 1 to all of those usernames. So now we're going to open Active Directory and we're going to hit refresh. And now we can see that we have 2 Clyde Braden. So Clyde Braden 1, and if I double click on this and go to account, we can see we have C Braden 1. Now let's just for fun run it one more time and see if we end up with Clyde Braden 2. New users.csv, press enter and refresh. And it's not working off the F5, so I'm going to right click and let's see how I can do this. There we go. I had to click over here on the left and hit F5. So now I have Clyde Braden 2. So if I hit account, I can see that it appended a 2 to the username. All right, so that is how you would switch the usernames to first initial dot last name and how you would append a number to the end of the script. So these functions are really, really useful. You can see that instead, I could have really done this in one function, but it was just easier for me to write this username taken function and then call it a bunch of times while I'm looping through these intervals. So hopefully you found this lecture useful. I hope it taught you some more about PowerShell and working with Active Directory. I sure did enjoy making it for you, and I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next lecture.